The air in the cathedral was thick with the scent of frankincense and the heavy silence of the city's most dangerous men. Nicola Perozzi stood at the altar, his scarred hands cradling a sleeping infant, ready to cement his legacy. But as the priest raised the holy water, the heavy oak doors groaned open. A woman in a tattered blue maid's uniform, her face a mask of righteous fury, sprinted down the aisle. "Stop the blessing!" she screamed, thrusting a glossy photograph into Nicola's face. And it wasn't a document or a forged certificate. It was a candid, intimate portrait. In the picture, Nicola's wife, Anselma, was glowing with maternal joy, leaning affectionately against the very priest standing before them, who was proudly cradling the infant. "You are baptizing a lie, Nicola." The maid's voice echoed off the stained glass. "I buried your real son 2 years ago. This child belongs to the man holding the water." In one heartbeat, the sacred silence shattered into 1,000 shards of impending violence. The photograph was small. That was the first thing Nicola noticed. How such a small, ordinary thing could carry the weight of an entire empire's undoing. His thumb pressed against the glossy edge, and the paper bent slightly under the pressure, the way cheap printed photos do when someone has carried them too long, too carefully, too close to the chest. He did not look up. Not yet. Around him, the cathedral had collapsed into a storm of murmured prayers and barely contained panic. His men had shifted instinctively toward the exits, hands disappearing beneath their jackets. The congregation, aunts and cousins and business associates flown in from as far as Nashville and Newark, sat frozen in the oak pews, caught between the instinct to flee and the fear of what fleeing might mean in the presence of the Perozzi family. Even the stained glass seemed to hold its breath, and the late morning light falling in cold, fractured blues across the stone floor. Nicola looked at the photograph. Anselma stood at the center of it, the way she always stood at the center of things, effortlessly, as though the world had quietly arranged itself around her without being asked. Her dark hair was loose, longer than she wore it now, and she was laughing. Not the practiced social laugh Nicola knew from 100 family dinners in their St. Paul estate. This was something raw and something private. Her head was tilted slightly back, one hand resting against her collarbone, the other arm hooked around a man's waist as naturally as breathing. The man was Father Virginio Lori, the same Father Virginio Lori who was standing 6 feet away, gripping a silver vessel of holy water with both hands, his vestment suddenly looking more like a costume than a calling. In the photograph, the priest was not performing. There was no elevated posture, no studied solemnity. He was simply there, present in a way that no man of the cloth should be with another man's wife. The infant cradled in the crook of his left arm, his right hand resting on the small of Anselma's back. The touch was not accidental. It was familiar, habitual. Nicola's jaw tightened. He shifted his gaze to the baby in his arms, the boy he had held for the past 11 months, as though the weight of him were proof that a man like Nicola Perozzi could still build something worth keeping. The child stirred slightly, eyelashes fluttering, soft, unknowing. And then Nicola made himself look. Really look. Past the Perozzi nose he had told himself he could see, past the dark hair he had credited to his Sicilian bloodline, past every comfortable fiction he had dressed the boy in, since the night Anselma had placed him in his arms in the maternity ward of Regent's Hospital. The eyes. Even half-lidded in sleep, they were wrong. Not Perozzi eyes, black and flat and commanding. Eyes built for interrogation rooms and card tables. These eyes had a quiet depth to them, a stillness at the edges that Nicola had always attributed to Anselma's side of the family. Now, standing in the light of a Minnesota cathedral with a damning photograph trembling in his grip, He understood exactly which side of the family he had been looking at. He glanced up at Virginio. The priest had not moved, but something in him had buckled. The color had drained from his face in slow, nor terrible stages, the way ice melts from a ledge, steadily, inevitably, until there is nothing left to hold. Nicola lowered the photograph. He did not crumple it. He did not throw it. With the deliberate calm of a man who had learned long ago that rage was most powerful when it was quiet, he folded it once along the center and slid it into the breast pocket of his jacket, pressing it flat against his chest. The maid, Frediana, she had said her name was Frediana, stood at the edge of the aisle, her blue uniform askew, her dark ponytail pulled loose from the sprint down the nave. She was watching him with the expression of a woman who had prepared herself for every outcome, except peace. Her hands were still raised slightly, as though bracing for the impact of whatever came next. To her left, Anselma had gone completely still. No more tears. The trembling had stopped. And that stillness, Nicola realized, told him more than the photograph ever could. He had spent 20 years learning to read rooms. It was how men in his position survived, by understanding, before anyone else did, when a situation had fundamentally shifted. When the ground beneath an arrangement had gone rotten. He understood it now. His consigliere, Artemisia Capone, was already moving along the far wall toward the priest's sacristy door. Two of Nicola's men falling into step behind her without a word exchanged. Whatever was in that room, Nicola intended to know about it before the holy water in Virginio's hands had time to grow cold. Frediana had not moved from the aisle. She stood with her shoulders pulled back and her chin level, the posture of a woman who had rehearsed this moment so many times in the privacy of her own mind, that the actual living of it had taken on a strange, dreamlike quality. Her uniform was wrinkled at the hem from where she had knelt to board the early bus from her apartment off Selby Avenue in St. Paul, onto a neighborhood that had never once concerned itself with the affairs of the Perazzi family, until, of course, it had to. Nicola turned to face her fully. The baby had been passed, wordlessly, to one of his lieutenants. A broad-shouldered man named Crucio, who accepted the child with a careful, bewildered grip of someone handed an object whose value he did not entirely understand. Nicola's hands were now free, and he held them loosely at his sides, and which those who knew him understood to be more dangerous than any raised fist. "Tell me," he said. Just that. Frediana drew a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long held. When she spoke, her voice did not shake. "You were in Ramsey County, the federal hold, October 2 years ago." She did not frame it as a question. She was anchoring him to the timeline, making sure he could not later claim confusion about the sequence of events. "Anselma told the family you were conducting business in Chicago. She kept everyone at a distance. Said you wanted privacy around the pregnancy." The congregation had gone so quiet that the distant sound of a delivery truck rumbling down the street outside was briefly, absurdly audible through the cathedral's stone walls. The boy was born healthy. Frediana's voice softened only slightly on those words, and the way a person softens when they must speak of something that deserved a gentler world than the one it was born into. 7 pounds, good color, strong cry. I was there. I helped Anselma through the labor in the house on Summit Avenue because she refused to go to a hospital. Said she did not want records of the birth until you could be present to register him yourself. Nicola's expression did not change, but his eyes had taken on the particular quality of a man filing every word away with the cold precision of a court recorder. He lived for 3 weeks. Frediana paused. Let that land. A fever. It came on fast, the way it does with newborns. By the time it was serious enough that I wanted to call for a doctor, Anselma had already decided there would be no doctor. Her jaw tightened at the memory. She said a hospital visit would raise questions. Questions about where you were. Questions about the timeline of the pregnancy. She said it would. Frediana stopped herself, visibly choosing her next words with care. She said it would complicate things. A sound came from somewhere in the pews. A woman's sharp intake of breath, one of the older aunts near the back, a widow from Duluth who had known the Perazzi family for 40 years and apparently still retained the capacity for shock. He died on a Tuesday. Frediana's voice had flattened now, carrying its grief the way old wood carries water. Quietly, until it can no longer hold the weight. Before dawn, I wrapped him myself. Anselma gave me a location, a patch of ground behind the groundskeeper's shed at a property your family owns outside of Red Wing. She drove me there, watched me dig, and when it was done, she told me that if I ever spoke of it, she would make certain my sister's family in Tucson understood the cost of my loose tongue. The cathedral held every word. Nicola stood at the center of it, absolutely still. To an outside observer, he might have appeared unmoved, a man carved from the same cold stone as the altar behind him. But those who had spent years in his orbit, who had watched him process catastrophic information across boardroom tables and courthouse steps, recognized the particular quality of this stillness. It was not the stillness of a man absorbing a blow, and it was the stillness of a man calculating the full structural damage before deciding which wall to tear down first. He turned his gaze slowly toward Anselma. She was no longer crying. She had not been crying for some time now. She stood beside the pew where a young girl in a blue dress had buried her face in her hands, and Anselma's own face had arranged itself into an expression Nicola had never seen on her before. Something stripped of performance, something almost relieved, and as though the secret's release had loosened a knot she had forgotten she was carrying. That expression told Nicola something no testimony could. She had been ready for this day. She had, on some level, been expecting it. From the far end of the cathedral came the sound of a door opening. The sacristy. Artemisia appeared in the doorway, her face arranged with the careful neutrality she reserved for moments when what she was carrying was too significant for a public expression, and in her hand was a leather satchel. She held it up just slightly and met Nicola's eyes across the length of the nave. Whatever was inside it, she had already looked. The silver vessel was still in Virginio's hands. He had not set it down. Perhaps he had forgotten he was holding it. Or perhaps some part of him understood that releasing it would mean releasing the last physical object that connected him to the role he had spent 20 years constructing. The humble servant, the community shepherd, the man of God who had presided over baptisms and funerals and confessions in this cathedral for 2 decades, all while building a separate life in the negative space between his duties. 2 of Nicola's men had positioned themselves at either side of the baptismal font, not touching the priest, not speaking to him. They did not need to. Their presence alone was its own language, and Virginio had been around the Perazzi family long enough to understand it fluently. The vessel began to tremble, and it started in his hands, a fine, almost imperceptible vibration, and moved upward through his wrists and into his forearms until his entire frame was carrying it, the way a tuning fork carries a note long after it has been struck. The holy water caught the fractured light from the stained glass and sent small, quivering reflections across the stone floor at his feet. Nicola walked toward him slowly. There was no theater in it, no performance of menace. When it was the walk of a man crossing a room to examine something he was no longer certain he had ever truly seen. He stopped 3 feet away and simply waited. Virginio's eyes dropped first. They fell to the infant, still held by Crucio near the front pew, the boy now awake and blinking with the mild, wondering attention of a child who has not yet learned that the world contains things worth fearing. Something moved across the priest's face at the sight of him. A raw and involuntary tenderness that could not have been manufactured and could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. The holy facade did not so much fall as dissolve. Please. The word came out stripped of all the resonance his voice carried from the pulpit. It was small, plainly human. Whatever you decide to do, the boy is not part of this. He does not know. He cannot know. Virginio's eyes lifted to Nicola's, and in them was the particular desperation of a man who has finally run out of exits. He is innocent of everything that happened between his mother and me. Everything. Nicola let the word sit there for a moment. Innocent. An interesting word to choose, in this building, in this company. Say the rest, Nicola said quietly. Virginio's throat moved. The vessel tilted slightly in his grip, a thin thread of water tracing down the outside of the silver and dripping onto the stone. And the sound of it, that small, precise drip, was the only thing in the cathedral that moved. He is my son. The confession came out with the exhausted finality of a man who had been holding his breath for nearly 2 years. Biologically, completely. Anselma and I... He stopped, reorganized himself. What we did was wrong. I have no defense for it. I have prayed over it more nights than I can count in a rectory that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cell. And I still have no words that make it right. From somewhere in the pews, an older man, one of Nicola's uncles, a retired enforcer who had driven up from his home outside of Madison, let out a single, low sound of disgust that carried the judgment of the entire room without requiring elaboration. Nicola had not blinked. His gaze remained fixed on Virginia with the patient, absorbing quality of a man who understood that the first confession was rarely the complete one. "I'm the child that died," Nicola said. "My son, you knew." It was not a question. The way he said it left no room for it to be. Virginio closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, what remained in his expression was something beyond shame. Something closer to the look of a man who had long ago accepted the full weight of what he carried and was only now being asked to set it down in front of witnesses. Anselma told me after, not before. I want you to understand that distinction, even if it changes nothing for you. It changes nothing, Nicola confirmed. The leather satchel that Artemisia had retrieved from the sacristy was now resting on the front pew beside her, still closed, her hand resting on top of it with the measured patience of someone waiting for the correct moment. She had not yet spoken. She did not need to. Nicola had seen her expression from across the nave, and he knew that whatever the satchel contained had not been placed in that rectory carelessly or in haste. Whatever was inside had been assembled over time, deliberately, by someone who had always known this day might come and had prepared for it accordingly. Nicola turned from Virginio and looked at Artemisia. "Open it." Artemisia Capon did not rush. She never did. Cubis, it was the quality Nicola had valued most in her across 17 years of service. The understanding that urgency and haste were not the same thing, and that the most devastating revelations landed hardest when delivered with composure. She unclasped the satchel with 2 clean, practiced movements and laid it open on the pew as though she were setting a table. The smell reached the front row first, old paper and leather, and something faintly chemical, the particular scent of documents that had been handled often, stored carefully, and never meant to be found by the wrong hands. She removed the contents in order, methodical, each item placed flat on the worn oak beside the last. The photographs came first. Not one or two, a stack of them, bound with a rubber band that had begun to dry and crack at the edges, suggesting they had been assembled long before this morning. Artemisia slipped the band free and fanned them across the pew's surface without comment. The congregation nearest the front craned forward instinctively, the way people do when they sense that what they are about to see will be impossible to unsee. Nicola did not move to look at them immediately. He watched Artemisia instead, reading her face, which was the more reliable document. "How many accounts?" he said. Artemisia's eyes lifted from the papers in her hands. "7 that I can identify quickly. Possibly more nested behind them." She set down the page she was holding and picked up another, running her finger along a column of figures with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent the better part of 2 decades managing the financial architecture of an organization that could not keep records in the conventional sense. "The earliest transfer I can see dates back 31 months. Portland, South Oregon. A property holding company registered under a name that does not belong to anyone in this room." Virginio made a sound from near the baptismal font. Not a word, just a sound, the kind that escapes a person when they realize the full perimeter of their exposure has been mapped. Artemisia continued without looking at him. From there, the funds moved in portions. Nothing large enough to trigger a single review. 12 transfers into an account in Charleston, South Carolina. A further series into a brokerage in Phoenix. She set the papers down and folded her hands over them with a deliberate stillness. Altogether, the figure I am comfortable confirming right now in this room is somewhere above $3 million. From accounts that were funded by this family. 3 million. The number settled over the cathedral the way cold settles into stone. Gradually, completely, until it was all anyone could feel. Nicola finally walked to the pew and looked at the photographs himself. He went through them the way he reviewed contracts. Without expression, without speed, turning each one over after examining it and setting it face down on the opposite side. Anselma and Virginio in what appeared to be a rented house somewhere warm. The light through the windows, the particular gold of a southwestern afternoon. The same 2 people at a restaurant table, leaning close, a candle between them. And then, and in the middle of the stack, something that caused Nicola's hand to pause for just a fraction of a second before continuing. A real estate listing, printed from a website. A property outside of Sedona, Arizona. 4 bedrooms, a long gravel drive, the kind of quiet, anonymous distance from the world that a man and a woman and a child might need if they intended to disappear into it and never return. The listing had a handwritten notation in the margin. A date, 6 weeks from today. And they had not been waiting to be discovered. They had been waiting to leave. Nicola set the listing down with the same measured care he had used for every other document. Around him, the men who had been with him the longest, the ones who had watched him navigate federal investigations and rival territories and the slow erosion of alliances, were reading his stillness the way sailors read weather. None of them spoke. It was Frediana who broke the quiet. She had remained in the aisle throughout, largely forgotten in the gravity of the documents. And when she spoke, her voice carried the particular weight of someone who had one final piece to offer and understood its significance precisely. "The property in Sedona," she said. "I have the deed. Anselma had me witness her signature on it 4 months ago. She told me it was a charitable donation." Frediana paused. "She told me a great many things." Nicola turned to look at her fully, and for the first time since she had sprinted through those cathedral doors, something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, but a form of recognition. She had carried this alone, for months. In an apartment off Selby Avenue, under the quiet threat of a woman who wielded fear the way others wielded currency. He was still looking at Frediana when the cathedral's main doors opened again behind her, and the sound of deliberate footsteps on stone announced the arrival of someone who had not been present for any of the morning's revelations, and whose appearance now, judging by the look that crossed Artemisia's face, was either a significant complication or something she had arranged herself. Nicola did not turn around yet. He kept his eyes on Frediana's and asked the question that had been forming since she first walked down that aisle. Who else knows where my son is buried? If this story moved you, consider subscribing to follow every chapter as it unfolds, so the next revelation finds you exactly where you should be. Ready. Nobody answered Nicola's question about the burial site. Not immediately. The footsteps that had entered through the cathedral's main doors belonged to a man Nicola's men recognized and flanked before he had taken 4 steps into the nave. A county official of some kind, and judging by his lanyard and the particular discomfort of a person who had arrived expecting a christening, and found something considerably more difficult to categorize, he was escorted firmly to a pew near the back and asked, without room for negotiation, to remain seated. The interruption lasted perhaps 40 seconds. It was enough time for Anselma to make a decision. The weeping had stopped sometime during Artemisia's inventory of the satchel. Stopped so cleanly and completely that several people near the front had not noticed the precise moment it ended. What replaced it was not composure. It was something older and less constructed than composure. Something that had been waiting underneath the performance of grief the way bedrock waits beneath topsoil, indifferent to whatever grows above it. She stepped forward, not toward Nicola, not toward the exit. She simply moved out of the marginal space she had occupied beside the pew and into the open aisle, as though she had decided that if the walls were closing in, she would at least choose her ground. You want to know what you lost. Her voice was steady and carried no particular volume, which somehow made it reach further than a shout. You don't, actually. You want to perform the grief of it, in front of your men, also in front of your family. Her eyes swept briefly across the frozen congregation before returning to Nicola. That is what you have always done with everything that was supposed to matter to you. Held it up to the light so others could see you holding it. No one moved. The young girl in the blue dress near the pew had gone very still. Her earlier tears dried on her cheeks. I gave you 7 years. Anselma's voice did not waver, though something in her jaw tightened between sentences. Thus, the only visible evidence of the effort the steadiness was costing her. 7 years in that Summit Avenue house, attending your dinners, receiving your associates, raising your profile in rooms you needed me to decorate. And what did you give me in return, Nicola? What was the actual substance of it? Not the estate, not the accounts, not the car that was always precisely the right car, but the living, daily substance of a life shared with another person. Nicola said nothing. His expression had not changed, but his stillness had taken on a different quality, the kind that comes not from control, but from the unexpected accuracy of a blow. Anselma let the quiet hold for exactly the right number of seconds before she continued. Virginio looked at me. The simplicity of it landed harder than any elaborate accusation could have. Not at what I represented, not at the optics of me beside him. He looked at me the way a person looks at someone they are genuinely afraid to lose. And I had forgotten that such a thing was possible until he did it. A breath. He gave me a family that existed in rooms no one else was allowed to enter. And yes, I protected that. I made terrible choices to protect it. I will carry those choices for the rest of my life. Her gaze moved briefly to Frediana, and something in it shifted. Not remorse, precisely, but an acknowledgement of a debt too large for the current moment to contain. Then it returned to Nicola, and the brief softness was gone. But do not stand in the house of God and grieve a son you would have spent the next 20 years converting into a weapon for your legacy. You were not mourning a child, Nicola. You were mourning an inheritance. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, onto the ripple of it moving through every person in the cathedral who had ever watched Nicola Perozzi speak of his heir, in the way powerful men speak of the things they intend to own forever. From across the nave, Frediana was watching Anselma with an expression that was difficult to read, not sympathy, and not its opposite either. Something more complicated. The expression of a woman who understood, on some unspoken level, that the person standing in that aisle had been both perpetrator and prisoner of the same arrangement, and that those two things did not cancel each other out so much as exist, painfully, side by side. Nicola turned away from Anselma, turned toward Artemisia. "The property outside Red Wing," he said quietly. "I want 2 men there within the hour." It was Artemisia's slight hesitation, barely a second, barely anything, that told Nicola the footsteps from the door had not been coincidental. "The official in the back pew," she said. "He came with a court order, Nicola. Someone called it in before this morning. Someone knew today would happen and filed paperwork in Ramsey County yesterday to freeze movement on all properties registered to the family." Nicola turned slowly and looked toward the back of the cathedral. The man in the lanyard met his gaze with the practiced neutrality of someone who had been briefed, very carefully, on exactly what kind of room he had walked into. Now tell us in the comments, did Anselma's words land for you? Or has she crossed a line that no explanation can reach? The story continues, and your voice shapes how we tell it. The man in the lanyard had a name, Dobrescu, according to the badge clipped below his collar, and he had the particular stillness of someone who had been trained to remain calm in volatile environments, but had never, in his career processing civil court orders for Ramsey County, encountered one quite like this. Nicola's men had not touched him. They did not need to. The cathedral's heavy oak doors were closed, and the 2 figures standing nearest to them communicated, through posture alone, that this was no longer a place people left without permission. Artemisia was handling Dobrescu quietly, speaking to him in low, measured tones near the back pew, explaining, Nicola assumed, that the court order would be examined thoroughly and that no one was being obstructed, merely asked for patience. It was the kind of conversation Artemisia had refined over years of operating in the borderland between the Perozzi family's interests and the institutional world that surrounded them. She was extraordinarily good at it. Nicola had turned his attention back to Frediana. She was still standing in the aisle, still upright. The blue uniform was creased badly along one side, where she had pressed against the pew during Anselma's address, and her dark hair had come fully loose from its ponytail and falling across one shoulder. She looked, in that moment, exactly like what she was. A woman who had risen before dawn, traveled across the city, and walked into the most dangerous room in Minnesota on nothing but the determination that what she carried was too heavy to carry alone any longer. "You said Anselma threatened your family," Nicola said. Not an accusation, an invitation to continue. Frediana nodded once. "My sister, Petra, she lives outside of Fargo with her husband and their 2 children. She said it plainly. The way people state facts they have repeated to themselves so many times that the emotion has been temporarily wrung out of them, leaving only the clean outline of the truth. Anselma came to me 3 days after the burial. She sat in my kitchen on Selby Avenue with a cup of tea she had made herself. And she told me that Petra's family was comfortable, that her husband had a good job, that the children were healthy and enrolled in a fine school. And then she told me that all of those things were conditions, not guarantees. The cathedral absorbed this quietly. She didn't raise her voice, Frediana continued. She didn't need to. She just looked at me across my own kitchen table the way she's always looked at things she considered manageable, and I understood precisely what she was saying. That my silence was the price of my family's safety, and that she had both the means and the patience to collect if I defaulted. From the pew nearest the font, one of the older Perazzi uncles, the retired enforcer from Madison, exhaled slowly through his nose. It was the sound of a man recalibrating everything he thought he had understood about the household on Summit Avenue. Nicola had not moved. So, what changed? Frediana's chin lifted slightly, and not in defiance, in the way a person raises their face when they are trying to locate the precise words for something they have never spoken aloud before, something that has lived only in the private architecture of their own conscience. Every year, she said, on the Tuesday in October when that boy died, I would go to Red Wing. Early in the morning, before anyone was on the roads. I would park at the edge of the property and walk to where we buried him, and I would leave something small, a stone, a handful of flowers from a gas station in Cannon Falls, nothing that would be noticed. Her voice had quieted, but it had not thinned. It carried, if anything, more weight in the quieter register. And every year I would stand there and think about what it meant that he was in the ground without a name recorded anywhere, without anyone in the world, outside of two people who needed him forgotten, who knew he had existed. She paused. Somewhere near the cathedral's vaulted ceiling, a pigeon shifted on its perch, the soft percussion of its movement briefly audible before the quiet resettled. When I found out about today's christening, when I understood that Anselma was about to watch her son be baptized into a name that did not belong to him, in a church presided over by his actual father, surrounded by a family that belonged to the boy she had buried without a marker, Frediana stopped, gathered herself with a single, measured breath. I decided that whatever she did to Petra's family, it could not cost more than what it was already costing to stay silent. I decided that someone in that cathedral needed to know that a child had been erased, even if that someone was the most dangerous person in the room. She looked directly at Nicola when she said it, without apology, without calculation. The weight of it settled over him visibly, not breaking anything in his expression, but adding to it, on the way successive layers of stone add to a foundation until the ground beneath begins to feel the accumulation. He turned toward Crucio, who still held the infant near the front pew. The boy had fallen back into a drowsy, untroubled quiet, one small fist loosely curled against Crucio's jacket lapel. Nicola studied the child for a long moment. The child who was not his, who had never been his, who had been placed in his arms in a hospital corridor with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent months rehearsing the handoff. "Nobody leaves this building," Nicola said, to the room rather than any single person in it. "Not until I say otherwise." It was Artemisia's voice from the back of the nave that cut through the subsequent murmur. "Nicola." The single word carried everything a long sentence would have taken. He turned. She was standing beside Dobrescu, and holding the court order open, her finger resting on a specific line near the bottom of the document. "You need to read the name of the petitioner." He walked toward her. The congregation parted without being asked, an instinctive clearing of the path, and the only sound in the cathedral was the measured rhythm of his footsteps on the stone, and the soft, oblivious breathing of the child he had spent 11 months believing was the continuation of everything he had built. And he took the document from Artemisia's hands, found the line her finger had indicated, read the name printed there. And for the first time since Frediana had come through those doors that morning, Nicola Perozzi went absolutely, completely still. Not with the controlled stillness of a man managing his reaction, but with the unguarded stillness of genuine surprise. The petitioner was not a county official. It was not a rival. It was not anyone connected to Anselma or Virginio or the accounts in Charleston or the property in Sedona. It was a name he recognized from a different chapter of his life entirely. A name he had not heard spoken in 11 years. Who do you think filed that court order? Drop your theories in the comments. This story is far from over, and every voice matters. The name on the court order would have to wait. Nicola folded the document with the same deliberate care he had used on the photograph. Pressing the crease flat with his thumb, tucking it into his jacket beside the other evidence of a morning that had remade itself, layer by layer, into something he was still assembling the full shape of. Whatever that name meant, whatever its arrival in this proceeding signified, it required a clarity of mind he could not give it while Virginio Lori was still standing at the baptismal font in his vestments, holding water intended to consecrate a lie. He handed the document back to Artemisia without a word and walked back down the nave. The congregation tracked him in silence. Some of them had stopped trying to interpret the morning and had simply surrendered to witnessing it. The older women with their rosaries, the men in their careful suits, the children who understood only that the adults around them had forgotten, for the moment, to perform normalcy. And the frankincense had thinned in the air over the past hour, its warmth replaced by something cooler and more austere, the cathedral returning to its native temperature beneath the stone and the glass. Nicola stopped in front of Virginio. The silver vessel had finally been set down. It rested on the edge of the baptismal font at an awkward angle, as though it had been placed there by hands that were no longer steady enough to position it properly. And Virginio himself had not moved from where Nicola's men had flanked him, but the architecture of the man had shifted. The shoulders that had carried decades of practiced authority now curved inward, almost imperceptibly, like a structure that has lost a load-bearing element and has not yet fully registered the loss. "I want to know where my son is buried," Nicola said. Not the field outside Red Wing, not what Anselma told Frediana, where he actually is. Virginio's eyes lifted. In them was the look of a man standing at the precise threshold between the version of himself that had maintained the deception and whatever came after. "Nicola, I am not asking for a conversation." The quiet in Nicola's voice was absolute. "I am asking for a location. You will give it to me." The priest's hands, hanging at his sides, curled once and then released. A breath moved through him, long, shuddering, the kind that precedes a collapse rather than a recovery. His knees bent before it seemed like a conscious decision, and then he was down on the stone floor of his own cathedral, the white and gold of his vestments pooling around him, his head bowed in the posture of a man who had run out of the particular courage required to remain upright under the full weight of what he had done. The sound that came from him was not theatrical. It was the raw, involuntary sound of a person encountering their own guilt without the buffer of distance or rationalizing or the daily maintenance of a constructed life. It filled the cathedral in a way that was deeply uncomfortable. The way genuinely private grief is always uncomfortable when it surfaces in public. Too unmanaged, too human, too stripped of the dignity that people instinctively try to extend to suffering when they can recognize it. Several people in the pews looked away. Frediana did not. She told me it would be better," Virginio managed between fractured breaths. His voice had lost every trace of the resonance that filled this space on Sunday mornings, that rose to the vaulted ceiling during the Eucharist and came back down softened and made somehow larger by the architecture. What remained was thin and scraped raw. She told me the field in Red Wing was where he was. I believed her. I needed to believe her. I told myself I had no reason to. He stopped, or pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, steadied himself with visible effort. I told myself I had no reason to verify it, because verifying it would have required me to acknowledge what I had allowed to happen to that child. What I had allowed Anselma to do while I stood in this building and spoke of grace every Sunday morning. Nicola crouched down. It was a deliberate movement, unhurried, that brought his face level with Virginio's, removing the vertical distance between them and making the conversation intimate in a way that was more unsettling in that moment than any posture of dominance could have been. "Then how do you know he isn't in Red Wing?" Nicola said quietly. Virginio closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were fixed on the middle distance, on something that existed only in the geography of memory. Because 6 months after we buried him, after Anselma said she had buried him, she came to me at night. Here, she was frightened about the property in Red Wing being sold, about the new owners potentially breaking ground near the groundskeeper's shed. A long pause. The candles on the altar behind them guttered slightly in some invisible current of air, their light shifting across the stone floor. She asked me to help her move him. She told me she could not do it alone again. The cathedral held the confession without comment. "We brought him here," Virginio whispered. "Beneath the crypt, where there is a section of the original flooring near the northeast corner. The stones were already loose from water damage. We reset them afterward. We thought—" His voice fractured completely on the last word, and he did not immediately attempt to reconstruct it. Nicola remained crouched, looking at the man on the floor of his own church, and the expression on his face was not the one the congregation might have expected from a man of his reputation in this moment. It was not rage, and it was not the cold satisfaction of having extracted what he came for. It was something more difficult to categorize. The expression of a man confronting, in the most concrete and irreversible possible terms, the reality of a child he had never held, never known, who had lived 3 weeks and then been moved twice in the dark, like something to be concealed rather than mourned. He stood, turned toward Crucio and the sleeping infant with the priest's eyes. Then he looked at his men and said, simply, "The crypt, northeast corner, now." It was Artemisia, moving toward the narrow staircase that led below the nave, who paused at its entrance and turned back with an expression that completed the unfinished sentence the morning had been building toward since Frediana walked through those doors. "The name on the court order," she said quietly, meant only for Nicola. "He's outside. He came in person. And he says he has been waiting 11 years to speak with you." It happened fast. Anselma had been watching the entrance to the crypt staircase with the focused, unblinking attention of a person conducting a private calculation. Measuring distances, tracking positions, cataloging which of Nicola's men were looking where and for how long. She had always been good at rooms. It was one of the things Nicola had admired about her in the early years, that quality of quiet, environmental intelligence. The way she could walk into a gathering, and within minutes understand its architecture better than the people who had arranged it. She had been applying that intelligence to this room for the past hour. The moment Artemisia turned toward the crypt staircase, and Nicola's attention shifted to follow her, and Selma moved. Not running, not yet, but crossing the distance to Crucio in 4 rapid strides, her hands outstretched, her voice dropping into the register she used when she expected to be obeyed without negotiation. "Give him to me. He is my son, and you will give him to me right now." Crucio took a half-step back on instinct, the infant shifting against his shoulder. The boy stirred at the movement, at the sudden percussion of raised voices and the sharp smell of collective alarm that moved through the pew nearest them as the congregation lurched backward. Then Anselma's hand closed around the child's arm. What followed was not a clean struggle. It was the ugly, lurching chaos of a confrontation that no one in the room had fully anticipated, despite every warning the morning had provided. Crucio twisting to keep the infant shielded, Anselma's grip tightening, her voice fracturing into something that abandoned all pretense of control. The boy now crying with the sharp, bewildered force of a child jolted from sleep into incomprehensible noise. 2 of Nicola's men converged immediately. A pew scraped across stone as someone in the congregation scrambled sideways. The young girl in the blue dress had pressed herself flat against the far end of her pew, her face buried in her arms. Frediana stepped toward them and then stopped, halted by the instinctive understanding that her involvement would only multiply the chaos. Nicola crossed the floor in 10 steps. He did not shout. He did not reach for the weapon holstered beneath his jacket, not immediately. He placed himself between Anselma and the exit, with the physical certainty of a man who had spent 30 years ensuring that the things he needed to remain in a room stayed in a room, and his presence alone was enough to make 2 of his men release the breath they had been holding. "Let go of the child," he said. Anselma's grip did not loosen. Her eyes were on Nicola's, and in them was everything she had not finished saying from the aisle. The desperation and the fury, and beneath both of those, Ustar running like a current under ice, the particular terror of a mother who understands that the next several minutes will determine whether she leaves this building with her son or without him. "You will not touch him," she said. The words were steady, but the steadiness was costing her everything she had left. "Whatever you decide to do to me, whatever you think I deserve. He is a child, Nicola, and he is 11 months old, and he does not understand a single thing that has happened in this room today." "I know what he is," Nicola said. "Then prove it." Her voice cracked on the last word despite herself. "Prove that you are capable of understanding the difference between what I did and what he is." Crucio had managed, in the press of the struggle, to shift the boy fully against his own chest, shielding him effectively, the infant's cries muffled against the fabric of his jacket. Anselma's hand was still extended, fingers open now rather than grasping, the posture of a woman whose body had not yet accepted what her mind was beginning to understand. Nicola reached into his jacket. The sound that moved through the cathedral at that movement was not a sound so much as an absence of sound. Every ambient breath and shuffle suspending at once, the way weather suspends in the seconds before something irreversible occurs. Several people closed their eyes. He held the weapon at his side, did not raise it. His eyes moved from Anselma's face to Crucio's, and Crucio, reading the unspoken instruction with the precision of a man who had served Nicola for 14 years, carefully turned the boy outward. The child's face was red from crying, wet at the lashes, his small chest still hitching with the aftershock of the outburst. But in the moment that Crucio turned him, the boy's eyes, those unmistakable, but quietly deep eyes that Nicola had stared at in the photograph for what felt like an hour, found Nicola's face and simply rested there. Not with recognition, not with fear, with the absolute, unguarded openness that belongs only to the very young, who have not yet learned to assign meaning to the expressions of adults. Nicola looked at him for a long moment. The weapon went back into his jacket. Something moved through the room at that. Not relief exactly, but the first loosening of a tension that had been wound to a point where the room itself seemed to have been holding itself rigid against the possibility of an irreversible outcome. "Crucio." Nicola's voice was even. "Take the boy to the anteroom off the west transept. Stay with him. No one else enters." And Selma made a sound. Involuntary, animal. The sound of a woman watching the last door close. "He will not be harmed," Nicola said. And he said it not with softness, but with a finality that was its own form of mercy. "That is the only promise I am making in this room today. And I am making it once." Anselma's legs appeared to stop cooperating with her. She caught herself on the edge of the pew, her hand pressing hard against the carved oak, her head dropping forward. The composed, venomous woman who had held the aisle an hour ago was gone, and what remained in her place was simply a person at the end of her resources. He's standing in a cathedral that no longer offered sanctuary to anyone inside it. Nicola turned toward the entrance to the church. The man outside, the one whose name had been on the court order, the one who had waited 11 years for this conversation, was still there. Artemisia had confirmed it before she descended to the crypt. And something in the way she had said it suggested the conversation could not be deferred much longer without consequences that would complicate what remained of an already irreparably complicated morning. Nicola straightened his jacket, looked once more at the altar, at the unfinished christening, the abandoned holy water, the cathedral arranged for a sacrament that would never be completed, and then he walked toward the doors. The man outside had a name Nicola had not spoken in 11 years. Donatello Perozzi, his father's younger brother, who had left the family's operation in Minnesota 2 decades ago and relocated to a quiet life in Savannah, Georgia, citing reasons that everyone understood and no one discussed. The court order had been filed, Donatello explained, not as an act of aggression, but as an act of protection. He had learned of Anselma's escape plan through a contact in Phoenix 3 weeks ago and had engaged an attorney in Ramsey County to freeze the family's movable assets before the lovers could access them. He had not warned Nicola because he had not been certain Nicola would believe him. He had not been certain Nicola would want to. The conversation lasted 11 minutes, conducted on the cathedral steps in the pale March light of a saint. A pall morning that had no interest in the weight of what it was witnessing. By the end of it, Nicola had extended his hand. Donatello had taken it. No further words were necessary between men who had learned, in different ways and from different distances, that the Perozzi name was a thing that could be carried or could be worn, and that the difference between the two mattered enormously. Nicola came back inside. The congregation had been quietly released in his absence. Artemisia managing the exodus with the practiced efficiency of a woman who understood that witnesses were a resource to be conserved, not squandered. The pews were empty now. The cathedral returned to something closer to its native quiet. The candles on the altar had burned lower, pooling wax collecting at their bases, the light they gave off warmer and less steady than it had been at the morning's beginning. Anselma was standing near the west transept, with 2 of Nicola's men beside her. She had retrieved her coat from somewhere and was holding it across her arm with the mechanical tidiness of a person performing ordinary actions, because the alternative is to stop moving entirely. She did not look at Nicola when he entered. She looked at the door to the anteroom where Crucio remained with the child, and the angle of her gaze was the most unguarded thing about her. Nicola stopped a few feet from her. The accounts Artemisia identified are frozen as of this morning. The property in Sedona has been flagged. The Charleston brokerage will receive a communication from our attorney before the close of business today. He paused, ensuring each sentence had room to land. The Summit Avenue house will be transferred out of your name by the end of the week. You will be provided transportation to wherever you choose to go, and a sum sufficient for 60 days of basic expenses. After that, this family has no further obligation to you." And Selma's jaw tightened. "And my son. The child is not a possession to be allocated." Nicola's voice did not harden on the words, which somehow made them more final than hardness would have. He requires stability. He requires people around him who are not currently facing the consequences of a serious deception. When you have established a life that can support him in a way that serves his interests rather than your circumstances, that conversation can happen through proper channels. He held her gaze. Not before. She wanted to argue. He could see it, the gathering of language behind her eyes, the old instinct to find the pressure point and apply herself to it with precision. But the morning had cost her the resources that instinct required. And after a moment, the gathering simply dispersed, leaving only the exhaustion that had been underneath it all along. She walked toward the cathedral doors without another word. Her heels on the stone were the last sound she made in that building. Virginia was escorted out through the side entrance, his vestments exchanged for the plain clothes he kept in the sacristy. A detail that struck Nicola later as its own kind of metaphor. Stripped of the ceremony, he was simply a man in a gray sweater and dark trousers, Easter blinking in the daylight of a Minneapolis-adjacent morning, carrying nothing that belonged to him anymore. The diocese would receive a full accounting. What they did with it was their own reckoning to conduct. The cathedral emptied by degrees until only Artemisia, Frediana, and 2 of Nicola's men remained. Artemisia was coordinating phone calls near the entrance, her voice low and continuous, the operational machinery of damage management already running at full capacity. She would be at it for days. Nicola had built his organization well enough to know it would survive the morning's revelations, restructured, recalibrated, but intact. Frediana was sitting in the front pew when Nicola approached her. She had not been offered a seat and had simply taken one, which he found he respected without needing to examine why. "Your sister in Fargo," he said. "Petra and her family. They'll have no further reason for concern." Frediana looked up at him. She did not thank him. She nodded once, the nod of a woman who had weighed the cost of this morning against its outcome, and was still in the process of determining whether the ledger balanced. Perhaps it never would. Perhaps that was the most honest thing about it. He left her there and walked to the narrow staircase at the rear of the nave. The crypt was cold. That was the first thing. The cold that exists below old stone buildings in the upper Midwest in early March. A cold that the seasons above have not yet touched, that persists in the dark with the patient indifference of geological time. The single electric fixture on the ceiling gave off a thin, yellowed light that reached the walls without fully illuminating them, leaving the corners in a permanent state of partial shadow. Artemisia's men had located the northeast corner. The loose stones had been identified and carefully lifted, set to one side in a row, and their undersides dark with the moisture that old foundations accumulate over decades. They had confirmed what Virginia's confession had described. They had, without being asked, given Nicola the space he was in now. He crossed the crypt floor alone. The northeast corner smelled of earth and cold stone and something faintly organic that the mind preferred not to examine too directly. Nicola crouched at the edge of the cleared area and looked at the ground below the removed stones. At the dark soil that had been undisturbed for the better part of 2 years, that had received what it received and kept the secret with the absolute, incorruptible discretion that only the earth itself can offer. He had not planned what he would do or say. He was not a man given to ceremony in private. Ceremony for Nicola Perozzi had always been a public instrument, A performance of power or solidarity or mourning that served the audience as much as the occasion. There was no audience here. There was only the cold and the thin yellow light and the ground before him. He pressed his hand flat against the soil. The cold of it moved through his palm immediately, deep and constant, without variation, the temperature of a place that had never been warm. His scarred fingers spread against the earth, and he held them there, not moving, not speaking, and simply maintaining the contact with the stubborn, insufficient tenderness of a man. Making a gesture he understood to be too late, and making it anyway. His son had lived 3 weeks, had cried and slept, and turned his face toward warmth with the blind, instinctive trust of the newly born, had never known the name Perazzi or the weight it carried, or the particular loneliness of being the inheritor of an empire, built by a man who had confused legacy with love for the better part of his adult life. Nicola kept his hand on the ground and let that understanding move through him without rushing it toward resolution. Some reckonings were not meant to be resolved. They were meant to be carried, permanently, honestly, without the comfort of a conclusion that would let a man return to being exactly who he had been before. He did not know how long he stayed there. Long enough for the cold to travel from his palm, up through his wrist, and settle in the bones of his forearm. Long enough for the thin yellow light above him to feel like the only honest thing left in a day that had been built from deceptions. When he finally stood, he did not look back at the corner. He walked toward the staircase with the measured pace of a man who has set something down and understands that setting it down is not the same as being free of it. Only the beginning of learning to move with the shape of its absence. At the top of the stairs, Artemisia was waiting. She had finished her calls. In her expression was the particular quality of a woman who had one more piece of information to deliver and was waiting for confirmation that he was ready to receive it. He nodded. "Donatello," she said. "He didn't come alone from Savannah. He brought someone with him, a woman." A pause, brief, careful. "She says she was present at the Summit Avenue house the night the boy was born. She says she has documentation that was never shown to Frediana. And she says she has been trying to reach you for 2 years." Nicola looked at the cathedral around him, the empty pews, the guttered candles, the abandoned christening, and understood, with the clarity that comes only after a long and devastating honesty, that the morning was not yet finished with him. Nicola Perazzi walked back toward the cathedral doors, toward the woman Donatello had brought from Savannah, and toward whatever truth remained uncollected in the wreckage of a single morning that had dismantled 20 years in the space of a few hours. The throne was empty. The heir was gone. And the reckoning, it turned out, had only just introduced itself.